patience. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for your patience. Of course, it was right before we were about to get started that my computer decided it wanted to die and restart, and my PowerPoint wouldn't work. And Evan, am I host? Because it's not. Yeah, you need to make me host because I can't share my screen. Aha, there we go. Okay, so let's get started. Are you seeing my full screen?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. I will try to reset now after some frantic scheduling. Thank you for those of us who joined us, either now as we are doing this, or for those of you who may watch this in the future, as it is recorded as one of Denver Landmark's webinar series. So this is our final in our series of diverse styles session that we are doing for Preservation Month. And so today we're talking about modernism. So I'm going to be following up on some of the various architectural trends that Evan talked about in the previous two webinars, and then talking about modern styles. So welcome to the webinar. We're happy to take questions. See here, you can raise your hand, use the Q&A if you have anything you want to ask us, and we will be posting this online. Okay, so let's jump in. So Evan last week took us up kind of into the 1920s, talking about a lot of the eclectic styles that were popular at that period, as well as the development of new styles, such as arts and crafts and prairie. And this was a time in American architecture in the 20s that there was just so much going on. You had so many diverse styles. You had the continuation and kind of rebirth of traditional styles like the colonial revival, these new styles, such as kind of American styles, prairie, arts and crafts. And then you also had the development of early modern styles. So in the 1920s. So at this time period, the majority of Americans were now living in cities. It's an increasingly rapid pace of change. And you see this especially in science and technology. So a lot of development of new products, new methods of construction, and to go along with that, a real search for wanting new forms. Architecture that would embody this new modern age. And modern's a term that's really used everywhere. It's used in architecture, but also in art, in theater, in literature, and really wanting architecture to reflect this modern age. So coming out of this, we get the Art Deco style. So it's named after an exhibition that occurred in Paris. See a postcard from there, and evolved in a very popular American style. Goals really to work, explore visual perception, have kind of a showy Hollywood style. So it's very much associated Art Deco with Hollywood glamour. So that's a good link. It often incorporates exotic influences and has a lot of geometric decoration. It is an architecture that is used primarily for commercial buildings. You do see it some in other things, particularly in Denver. We have a lot that is used for multi-residential, so apartment buildings. We also have institutional buildings, such as schools, but it's really associated with that kind of flashy commercial. A lot of it is used for theaters. Think that the Grand Movie Palace, and in here we have the Paramount, which is one of our great examples of Art Deco in Denver. So some key features. You get things like the stepped parapet, flat roofs, decoration. So a lot of that, as I said, kind of elaboration. So the spandrel panel, that area between the windows, there's a lot of elaborate decoration there. It's a very angular style. So a lot of vertical influence, sharp corners, sharp angles. You see that in the stepping. You see that in the geometric motifs that are very angular. You get a lot of things like zigzags and chevrons. And it's the very linear appearance. In Denver, we also get a lot of terracotta, the big terracotta city, so we get often terracotta decoration on our Art Deco. So Evan started previously in the previous webinars talking about how we see somewhat of an evolution of what we get, how we interpret styles in Denver versus how these styles are interpreted elsewhere in the US. So we've talked about Denver was a really big brick city. So nationally, Art Deco tended to be a stucco. It's often white, plain. Stucco is what is most commonly associated with Deco, but in Denver, we still love our brick. So we have some really unique examples of doing those geometric Art Deco patterning in brick. So you see here some of those various brick pattern designs, schools, a fire station, and then also another theater, the Mayan, awesome example of Art Deco that incorporates, as I talked about, those exotic influences that, kind of very theatrical influences that you see often in Art Deco. So another related style that was becoming popular at the same time of Art Deco is Art Moderne. And these are often somewhat, kind of combined and confused. But if you really think of Art Moderne as being the streamlining style, that's a great way to remember it. So Art Moderne is really influenced by the popularity of streamlining. You saw that, in things like the trains and ships of the era, the early automobiles. It's all about minimal wind resistance, really designing for speed. Well, obviously, even though buildings aren't going anywhere, it was also really popular to incorporate some of those same streamlining trends into architecture. And, to really show that it was, another way of showing, modernism. So streamlined designs often incorporate a lot of curved forms, horizontal lines, often nautical or other transportation elements, but sometimes you'll see things like porthole windows and other things that kind of have a nod to transportation in the design. So here you see one of our great Art Moderne buildings, the American Woodman building. And if you're trying to distinguish those differences between Art Deco and Art Moderne, they're both early modern, but Art Moderne is about the curves. So whereas Art Deco is very vertical and very linear and sharp edged and sharp corners, Art Moderne is more horizontal. It has those horizontal bands and it's all about the curves. So you get those curved sweeping corners that, have that influence of the streamlined design. So some of the things to look for are the smooth wall surfaces, usually stucco, but in Denver we get other materials like terracotta and brick as well. Horizontal, rounded corners. The windows often wrap the corners, so you get long horizontal bands of windows. You often get glass block and things like curved metal canopies as well. So like with Art Deco, we kind of had our own unique take on Art Moderne in Denver that incorporates a lot of brick. So instead of some of these examples that you see with bright kind of enamel panels that you see elsewhere that really fully go for that kind of streamlined, smooth effect, we still like our brick in Denver. And so a lot of our Art Moderne buildings are still, have those curves, but are still using brick construction. And you also get some hybrids. As I talked about, Art Moderne and Art Deco are styles that often kind of get lumped together. And it is not always a clear delineation between the two. As you see here, you may have a building with curved corners, but also includes some sharp corners that it has both horizontal and vertical emphasis, stepped parapets and curved corners. So while they are two distinct styles with different kind of stylistic palettes, you can also combine them. And so you do often get architects that can work in those combined styles. Okay, then we have international styles. This is really what's kind of seen as the beginning of the kind of the more serious modern design. So it came to the US really through an exhibit of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1932, titled the International Exhibition of Modern Architecture. So this is what gives it its name in the US. That's why it's called international. So it was really looking to these international examples of this new type of functional architecture. They, in the exhibit, really kind of defined it as architecture that had regularity and balance, but without symmetry, had no applied ornament, so a real emphasis on functionality and getting rid of decoration, and as an architecture that emphasized volume over mass. So with things like thin surface materials, giving buildings a much lighter appearance. And in the 1930s, you had a prominent architects coming from Europe, where they kind of originated the style, fleeing conflict and war and coming to the US and working in a lot of the major architecture schools in the US. And so you really then have them kind of bring that European style into American architectural practice. So it is a style that is both residential as well as commercial and institutional. So really international style has a very wide reach. When it comes to the US in the 1930s, it's mainly an avant-garde style. So you mainly see it on the East Coast, some on the West Coast. It's definitely a style of the elite. But as you move kind of into the post-war period, it really becomes the predominant style and becomes much more widely accepted there. So Denver doesn't have a lot of really high style, international style buildings. This is one of our better examples, the Joshua House, which is really lovely. So some of the key features you see here. Kind of functional design, minimal decoration, flat roof. The wall really reflects interior building uses. So instead of feeling like we must have regularly patterned window openings because that's what's expected, instead you get large areas of blank wall on some facades, and then you get whole bands and real large areas of plate glass windows on other walls. Asymmetrical. And just really kind of simplicity, emphasize form, and really reduce any decoration. So here you see a great example of international style commercial. So international style after the war definitely became prominent for skyscrapers and other large-scale commercial buildings as well. One of the key features is really the curtain wall construction. So the fact that you could have a steel frame that just really kind of had this kind of curtain wall draped over it with the bands of windows and other spandrel panels. So key features, that kind of combination of glass and metal, the big horizontal bands of windows, the smooth surfaces, and really emphasis on building functionalism. And I have here, if you notice, as far as the timeline, so international is introduced in the 30s, have a question mark on the end because it kind of keeps coming back. It kind of keeps evolving, kind of prominent for quite a while, faded out, but then you still get some international style buildings that kind of come back. So it's still a question mark. It's still evolving of when we are going to decide that international has really ended. So here's another one where you see quite the contrast between what is an international style building in Denver and what is international elsewhere. So Denver wasn't ever really as into the totally stark white boxes that characterize kind of really that avant-garde version of the international style. So we did the reduced decoration, the kind of boxy forms, the bays of windows, the asymmetrical, but as you see here, a lot of that still often used brick, still had a little bit touches of color. So we have a lot of buildings that are influenced by the international style, but maybe not pure examples of the international style. So in this period, we really have a lot of influence of material innovation. As I said, technology, science really big, and development of early modern architecture. And this becomes even bigger during the war. So during the war, a lot of development of mass production techniques, particularly one of the big ones, the development of Quonset huts that could be shipped anywhere around the world, erected really quickly. You see this then after the war with the exploration of other types of mass-produced housing with things like the Lestron home, which came, all shipped, all the parts in a truck to be put together on site. And so these mass production and new materials become huge in the development of post-war suburbs as builders are using these techniques of mass production to meet the demands for post-war housing. So America after World War II really embraces modernism. So this becomes, a popular style rather than just one of many styles. Modernism really becomes dominant. It's seen as really, break from the past, this bright post-war future with America being dominant in the world, this baby boom, growth, big, economic prosperity. So turn away from those historical styles, really emphasize functionalism. It goes along with this real enthusiasm for new technology. And modernist architecture being seen as rational, efficient, confident, fitting this post-war image, but not overly flashy. And really seen as a universal solution for building everywhere. And with this kind of evolution of new technology, as well as the need for really rapid construction after the war to deal with the baby boom and a real housing shortage, you also get a real evolution of the floor plan. This also is seen in the ways that people live in the post-war house, which was also a more casual, more family-oriented, more casual layout. So you see smaller footprints, but more open spaces. So more open plan, more multifunctional rooms. As you see here, you have the living room that goes into the dining room and the kitchen. You have an all-purpose room. So much more flexible layout. Also, in a lot of places, eliminated basements. Those are a lot more expensive. Standardized window and door sizes, standardized plumbing, got rid of second stories, got rid of any decoration, minimized hallways, all things that made the construction less expensive. And you have things like planning for additions. You've got a ton of starter homes being built just after the war. So you see things like this and identified the future bedroom. So they weren't going to build it now because it's just all about getting just housing done, but planning so that it was going to be logical locations that it would be easy to add on to later. So post-war styles. Right after the war, the predominant style was the minimal traditional. As this is built in really large numbers to meet post-war demands in Denver. You see it in neighborhoods like University Hills. So small, affordable, and influenced by previous colonial revival and English cottage styles. So it has elements of the Cape Cod, elements of the English cottage, but really stripped down to the, really simple modern version of a cottage. So really minimal ornamentation. The only ornamentation you get is sometimes you may get shutters, often sometimes a projecting gable as well. But otherwise really simple form. So it's generally a low to medium pitched side gabled roof. You get really close eaves, sometimes a really simple shelter or overhang at the entry, but no elaborate porches and no other real decoration. And here, because you are starting to get into mass housing, you don't get as much variation between Denver and other places. We still like brick a lot. So that last example I showed you with siding, that's from Denver as well. But Denver also has a lot of brick minimal traditional. Elsewhere in the country, probably brick is not as common for minimal traditional, but with development of mass housing and builders, you definitely start to get less variation regionally. You then have the ranch house. So I have attributed to Cliff May in California, who did kind of these custom houses that were really influenced by the kind of sprawling kind of California ranch building. So really intended to be a simple form, open floor plan, kind of easy to live in building. And ranches really became our predominant post-war residential style and maintained their popularity for quite a while. So certainly through the 70s, you still see some ranches after that. So really became the predominant residential style. So key features. Real horizontal influence. You have this long rectangular floor plan that is oriented parallel to the street. You get large picture windows that face the street. So it's definitely a design that has a real relationship to the street. Minimal decoration, open and casual layout. Definitely the incorporation of the automobile by this point. So by the 50s, everyone, you have to incorporate the car. So you either get carports or attached garages. In early examples, through the 1950s, you get prominent chimneys, the low pitched roof with a really deep eave overhang. So that's one of those things that really distinguishes it from the minimal traditional we just saw. Those generally tend to be a little bit boxy, not as big as sprawling, and they also have close eaves versus the deep overhanging eaves that you get with either the hipped or the side gabled roofs of the ranch house. So some examples here again, because of the kind of mass builders, not quite as much of a differentiation between Denver and elsewhere. You do get some unique regional styles to ranch. So as you see in the middle there on the left, that's like an example of a storybook ranch. So kind of adding a little bit more whimsy and detailing there to the ranch. The top, see the shutters. There's definitely some kind of ranches that have a little bit of colonial revival influence to them. But ranch styles are, pretty recognizable as ranch houses around the US. Then you have the evolution of the contemporary building. Today, we often refer to it as mid-mod or mid-century modern because contemporary gets a little confusing. It's called contemporary in the 1950s, but clearly contemporary is no longer contemporary. So we have to try to come up with alternate phrasing. So this borrowed more directly really from modernism, whereas the minimal traditional and the ranch houses were more simplified version, kind of modern versions of the traditional forms. Contemporary was really trying to do something different, really more directly follow this kind of modern trend. A lot of these are constructed with post and beam construction. So that same thing, where you see that it's just kind of your hanging walls on a frame, like you got with the international style. So that's why you see in a lot of the contemporary houses, those projecting roof beams, because that's post and beam, and then, just kind of put up wall panels. So some of the key features, really low pitched roofs. So sometimes it's sloped roofs, sometimes flat roofs, sometimes you may get other interesting kind of inverted things like butterfly roofs as well. A real emphasis on a connection to the outdoors. So contemporary style often tends to be more private to the street. So often doesn't have that big picture window and that parallel to the street that you get with the ranch house. Instead, you get these unusual window forms, like these windows that are located up on the eaves. And then you get really huge kind of walls of windows that either open onto a side patio, often exotically referred to as a lanai, or onto a rear deck or rear patio. So there's a lot of influence of kind of emphasis on indoor outdoor space with large walls of windows connecting to side or rear yards. It's very low slung, low profile, a lot of connection to the landscape with that indoor outdoor space. You often get contrasting different wall materials. This is an example from Crescenta Park in Denver, and you get the mix of the concrete block with the vertical siding. So here again, a little bit more variation here in contemporary probably than the other styles, just because that happens with the contemporary, which is not quite as common and not. You definitely had some big builders who were designing in this style, like Eichler, who was designing in California, and who the designers, the Wolf brothers, and in Wolf and Crescenta Park, just kind of took over and went and borrowed a lot of Eichler designs. So you get those similarities. See again, Denver loves its brick. So even most of the rest of the country, contemporary or mid-mod, typically is not designed out of brick, but we do have our brick mid-mods here in Denver. In other places like California, you could also open up even more that indoor-outdoor. So a lot of the Eichlers had things like courtyards, interior courtyards, really emphasizing indoor-outdoor space, but with our climate and weather, a little bit more restrictions on those in Colorado. Then we have our commercial style from mid-century, the Googie style. So that name comes from Googie's coffee shop, which is considered to be the first or originator of the Googie style. The Googie style is often also referred to as doo-wop or coffee shop modern because of those kind of original examples. And it's the first architectural style that's really designed purely for commercial buildings located along major automobile arterial roads. So it's all about the relationship to the car and the relationship to the road. So here we have some pictures from Denver, one of our white spots that used to be all over Denver, and one of our big tops, two of the big kind of Googie style chains that we had historically in the Denver metro. So as I said, Googie's all about the relationship to the street. So it's style that's actually designed also to look great at night because it's all about illumination and drawing in cars. So kind of really a unique style in that way, in that it's all about, looking good by day or night. So some of the key features, dramatic roof forms, well illuminated, really draw in people passing by car. It's going to have an adjacent parking lot because you have to have a place for people to park their car. Often incorporates multiple materials with things like stone, as well as concrete, glass, metals, really big walls of windows so people can see in. Often includes bright colors, integrated signs. Another thing, using signage to help draw in those automobiles, and a lot of geometric shapes and motifs as well. So here you can see some examples. Snarf's recently in Denver has done some great rehabs of some Googie buildings. So here you see a Snarf's that's located in a Googie gas station, and another Snarf's that is located in one of those old Big Top stores. Okay, then kind of moving on into how we see modernism evolve in the 1960s. So you get the return of some of the traditional styles and elements, and interest in kind of more sculptural forms. So international and that kind of part of modernism tended to be very angular, and is interested in, returning the curve to architecture. So if we think, kind of looking back to the Art Moderne, an interest more in relating to the context and the environment, that everything wasn't just purely functional and that you could just put down the same building anywhere, that, international was all about universal style, and instead having a style that more related to the individual building use and the individual location, really explore materials. So that's a continuing trend of these kind of new technologies and what you can do. And we start to see the influence as we get later then into 20th century of, computers and how that can change how we can design as well. So we have Formalism. This is the Byron Rogers building in Denver, a great local example of formalist design. So this was a break from the international style in that it was a break from pure functionalism. You started to get the return of some traditional elements, even if they were simplified, they were traditional. So things like the arcade that you see here, it's a very a streamlined, simplified interpretation of an arcade, but it is returning a form. And you also start to get some decoration, particularly in the materials. A lot of the international style was very stark, just glass, metal, like stucco, and wanting to return some more luxe materials. So you start to get things like marble and other textured materials, textured screens, and really wanting to have these kind of identifiable monumental buildings. So formalism tends to be primarily institutional. You get it on things like here, college campus. This is a building on the campus of the University of Denver. You get it for things like banks, government buildings. So it's primarily large scale and institutional, definitely, things that we're trying to be monumental. So as I mentioned, the return of some traditional forms such as arcades, simplified arcades, return of materials. So some of the other key features, often integrated into the landscape and include features such as reflecting pools like you see here. Generally has a flat roof, often with a projecting flat roof slab, and it's often set kind of up on a raised podium as well. You get kind of symmetrical elevation, so the kind of return of an element of classicism in the use of symmetry as well. So here we have just some examples from Denver, or one at the bottom, it's Littleton, so Denver area, as well as some other examples. Probably one of the best known, Lincoln Center there on the bottom left, kind of a key example of formalist design with that, and if you can see the return of the arch and the arcade, but in a very kind of simple way. And we have Neo-Expressionism. Another style that was just really wanting to get basically literally out of the box that was international style with its boxy form, and wanted to be able to have express form over function, have a more emotional architecture, really explore technology to kind of have these more forms that weren't all about rational building techniques and could be much more expressive. So here we have, I think, probably our two best known examples of Neo-Expressionism in Colorado. We have the Sleeper House and we have the chapel at the Air Force Academy. So two really excellent examples of the Neo-Expressionist form. So Neo-Expressionist gets going in the 1950s. It's another one that kind of, where do you have the end date? You kind of really prominent through the 60s. After that, you still get some isolated examples. So here's the Key Savings and Loan Association building in Inglewood, another really awesome expressionist design. So key features are really dynamic designs that really express movement. You get a lot of spatial effects on organic forms, sometimes incorporate metallic elements, really sweeping curves. You can get convex, concave, faceted surfaces. So really kind of playing with complex engineering. So here we have some examples. Really, it's the Neo-Expressionist is so unique, and it's so much about expressing kind of the individual kind of vision of the architect and the site and the use of the building that it's really hard to generalize at all. But here's some, we have in Colorado, some great examples of some Charles Hartling designs, the top one from Boulder, the one below that, a church in North Glen. We have Brutalism. So here, probably our best known example of Brutalism in the US, we have the Boston City Hall. So initially, really, Brutalism was a design philosophy that was really associated with a lot of post-war planning, initially in England with a lot of rebuilding after the bombing of World War II. In the US, a lot of it becomes associated with urban renewal and some of those big new kind of urban development plans. Brutalism is all about the concrete. So it's all about concrete as a material. It was convenient, inexpensive, which was key, and really versatile. And you could do really monumental things with concrete. And the name, Brutalism, is really also all about the concrete. So unlike, I think a lot of people think Brutalism, it's named that because it's a brutal architecture style. No, Béton Brut means rough, raw concrete in French. And so the word just really comes from meaning rough concrete. So it's where we get the word brutalism from. So here, I think one of our great examples in Denver, maybe familiar with some fights, and this has been approved for demolition. This is the Channel 7 building in Denver. So key features of brutalism, I said concrete. So it's all about concrete. That's really the only material. And it's really about expressing the mass and the form of concrete so that you kind of really see that building form. Buildings are often integrated with a landscape or a plaza. You get often some extreme engineering, things like cantilevers here, where you get this really weighty building that appears to float. You get these really sculptural blocky shapes. Really explore the textural qualities of concrete. So you get a lot of different treatments of concrete. You get scored concrete, textured concrete, smooth concrete. And this is a great example here of being able to see those different concrete textures. Really deep set penetrations, which you see here, and a lot of repetitive geometric patterns and forms. So here you see some examples, Colorado and elsewhere. As you saw in the Channel 7 building, and you see here in the NCAR campus, we incorporated color. Again, we like our brick, we liked our red brick, and we incorporate that in some of our brutalist designs as well. Also, Federal Reserve there on 16th Street is another great example, and then some of the brutalism elsewhere. Okay, gonna wrap up, just talk a little bit about kind of modernism kind of starts to end and then where we're at today. So in 1970s, you had increased interest in historicism and vernacular forms, and rediscover some of the aesthetics of those pre-modern styles. Interest again in things, wood, wood siding, earth tones, stone, kind of, so moving away from just the steel and glass into kind of some of those more organic forms. So you get this neo-eclectic movement that really starts in the 70s and really continues today. So I know in my neighborhood, at least on the University Hills, there's still a lot of things that are being built that would be classified as neo-eclectic. So incorporating kind of elements of all those different styles that Evan has talked about in his previous webinars, a little bit of that colonial revival, a little bit of that Tudor, kind of bringing those all together in these kind of neo-eclectic styles. One of those really prominent ones is we get the Neo-Mansard, probably one of the best known of those that really came in the 70s. You see, that really distinctive mansard roof. So that dual slope roof that we saw previously in the Second Empire style comes back and becomes both a commercial and residential style. So probably best known through things like the roofs of Pizza Hut and McDonald's. But it was a really relatively inexpensive way to kind of create this dramatic effect. So in Denver, you get it both in residential architecture, as you see there at the top. Also, you get it in commercial architecture that really just overly emphasized where basically the whole building has become the roof form. So we kind of get that combination of modern elements, kind of modernizing this kind of earlier traditional style. So just to wrap up and end, then I'll leave you with some thoughts of, what do we think of the styles of today? Architectural historians are starting to try to come up with terminology. It's always hard, when you're in a moment, you kind of have to step back and reflect, what are we going to call these things? But so these are some of the terms that are being used so far. We have the decoupage style. So basically, kind of a modern box. So we see that, kind of evolution of styles, but with bringing back different materials. So it's basically using kind of an international style modernist box as a canvas to have tiles and woods and metals and all sorts of different materials. We have the slightly askew, which is also kind of, a little bit of that contemporary style in its design, has a lot of those angular roof forms, it's kind of, just little bit wacky, you know, adding some interest there with some of those angular forms, but I definitely think we could look at the slightly askew as that kind of predecessor, you know, of evolution of the contemporary style. Looking at really functional architecture, we have the cargo texture, are also called the architainer. So either architecture that actually is built out of shipping containers or is just designed to resemble the architecture of shipping containers. And then looking at more traditional styles, we kind of have the modern farmhouse that is really popular in Denver at the moment. That's combining kind of those kind of more traditional gable front forms with some more modern materials and modern tweaks. So that is it for our tour of architectural styles. Thank you for joining us. Either Evan and I would be happy to answer any questions if we have them.
Yeah, feel free to drop any questions in the chat here at the bottom if you have them.
Okay.
Come in.
Not then, just thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. Again, as a reminder, all three parts of this webinar series are going to be available. The first two parts are already available on the Denver CPD YouTube channel. So you can view them at your convenience on there. And of course, show them to all of your friends so that we can, we're trying to rack up the views really. But so thanks so much for joining us. Everyone, enjoy what's left of Preservation Month and take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.